The Early Church and the Word Elect. Unusual title because English was not around during the early church. It's a borrowing language which is borrowed from Greek, from Latin, from French, Anglo-Saxon, etc. So it's really about the languages at the time of the early church. Now, we read about that in our very Bible because Pilate put a sign above Jesus' head when Jesus was crucified. And on this sign was written, "The King of the Jews." But both Luke and John mention the languages in which this sign was written. And they say the same thing. It was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Now, Latin was the new language on the block because it was the language of Rome, of the Romans, and they just conquered, acquired the land of Israel, Judea and Galilee and so on, up to about 50 years before Jesus came. And so it was a new language on the block. Hebrew was the older language, which was in which the Jewish scripture was first written in. And it's the language that was very much regarding the Jews, etc. But the main language around was Greek. And those are the three main languages in use in Jerusalem. Pilate was an intelligent man. He knew that the chief priests and Jewish leaders wanted Jesus out of the way because of envy, he says. Well, it is written that he recognized it was because of that. So he informs us by having this sign in three languages what the languages were in Jerusalem and Judea. And this is where the church was born. The church was born in Jerusalem and then went into the other language. And Greek was the main language of the day. Why? Because Alexander the Great, in the 4th century BC, began the process of fighting battles with the Persians and Medes and Persians, and the whole known world was overtaken by the civilized known world, was taken over by Alexander the Great. And then when he died, it got split into 4 regions, again Greek-speaking regions. So for centuries, around to the time of the Romans, and that their language was then grew and grew in importance. Greek was the main language for trade, commerce, for administration of government, and for culture. And round about the 3rd century BC, during that century, the Jewish scripture was all translated into Greek. And it's this version of the Old Testament which was in use in Jesus' day. And this Greek version is known as the Septuagint because of a tradition that 72 scholars were involved in translating it. And so this word 70, Septuagint, has come about, and it's the name that we use for the version, that Greek version of the Old Testament. Now, the beauty about the Septuagint is that it's also the language in which the New Testament was written. And so it's a useful tool for the meaning of words in the New Testament, and hence this video. And but because of the lack of use of the Septuagint, we miss out on reading the New Testament in different ways. So let's see how that happened. Well, in the first 2 to 3 centuries, in fact, first 4 centuries of the early church, Greek was the main language used. And we know that because the first ecumenical council was in Nicaea in 325 AD, and all the proceedings and the records of the event were done in Greek. So we know the language was very much still very prominent then. And what happened is at the tail end of the 4th century, Jerome was asked to, who was schooled and learned in Greek and in Hebrew and in Latin, to do a Latin version, because by this time the west of the Mediterranean and many more people were speaking Latin and were losing the use of the Greek. And Latin versions began to appear, and all this was done by hand and copied by hand and so on. So Jerome was asked to do an official Latin translation, and as he did so, he made use of the Septuagint. He actually began translating the Old Testament from the Greek version into Latin. But because he was familiar with the Hebrew, he also looked at the Hebrew text and realized that the Septuagint, although it was accurate in quite a few places, was also totally incorrect in other places. And so he then translated for the Christians Old Testament directly from the Hebrew, and so then began the loss of use of the Septuagint. But it's a loss of use that is to be careful about, because Paul in his writings was quoting things with an understanding of his hearers of the Septuagint. I'm not just talking about the fact that we've got verses of the Old Testament quoted from the Septuagint in the New Testament now, which is why our English Bibles read differently. If we read what Jesus said or what Paul quoted and compare it with the Old Testament that we have, which is directly from the Hebrew, there's differences, and the reason there's differences is because they were quoting the Septuagint version. Now, Paul also says things which, when we look at in our Old Testament directly translated from the Hebrew, we find, what's he on about? For example, in 1 Corinthians 14:34, Paul talks about, as the law also says. And you look up the Old Testament and the law and think, I can't find it here. It's not here. But if we look at the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, we can find it. He's really talking about Genesis 3:16. Now, I've written about that elsewhere, but we're not, talking about the subject of women in leadership, which is what 1 Corinthians 14:34 speaks into. But that was an example to show that missing out the Septuagint context and influence is missed out, because ever since Jerome translated from the Hebrew into English, which is a good thing to do because it's more accurate, it's more true to the inspired original text, the Hebrew text, with exceptions of there's a section of Ezra and a section of Daniel and one or two verses, I think Genesis and Jeremiah, which are in Aramaic. That's the original language those small sections of the Bible were written in. But for our conversation and the word elect, the word to choose, the word chosen, the word elect are not in any Aramaic sections at all. So that's, and since, we can concentrate on the Greek, which is good. Now, with the Greek version of the Old Testament in the first Christians' hands for several centuries, and the New Testament in Greek, it's reasonable to understand that the way a word was understood in the Greek Old Testament is the same way the word was used in the New Testament, because the New Testament authors, writers, Paul and Luke and so on, quoted from the Septuagint, and so it's reasonable to see that they were using the same words, with the same meaning. And in our English Bible, the word elect comes from two words. We have the Hebrew Old Testament translated to English. We get the Greek New Testament translated to English. Now, in the Old Testament, elect is translated from the word bakir, and in the New Testament, elect is translated from eklektos. Now, in the Greek Old Testament, every place where bakir is found, it's translated as eklektos. So we only need to look at this one word, eklektos. So eklektos is the only word read by the early Christians relating to the word elect in today's English Bible. So, eklektos, what does that mean? Well, let me share a little story first. In the 90s, I went to a meeting in London. I live in the southeast of England, in the UK. And in the 90s, I went to a Nicholas Christian Fellowship celebration event. And at the celebration event, there was a bookstall afterwards, which I perused, and I saw a copy of this book, God's Strategy in Human History, by V. Paul Marston and Roger Forster. And I read it, and I found it quite interesting that, by the way, before I carry on, this version is out of print, and you can't get it anymore. And a new edition was produced by an American publisher, which is now available here. And there's, it's mainly pretty much the same, except for some sections of quotes from the early church, which are slightly less accurate in this version. But it's the crux of the book is all there. And what I read in there, which I found interesting, was that they mentioned this word eklektos, which you've mentioned, and that in the Septuagint it was to do with choice silver. In Proverbs 8:19, it's mentioned as choice silver, quality silver, which is a totally different meaning to somebody selected, chosen, elect, which is what elect means. It means somebody chosen. Elect means something selected. And somebody quality, it's a different meaning, something of quality. And so I thought, well, this is important. And so I rang up a friend called David Locke, who's manager of Manor Christian Centre in Streatham. And I said, can you get hold of a copy of the Septuagint for me? I want to check this out, if this is true. And he says to me, well, would I like a concordance to go with that? It just so happens he had a copy of both the Septuagint and a concordance. What a concordance is, it's a dictionary, if you will, where you can find every place for every word within that book. So there's concordances for the whole Bible in English. Strong's is one, it's a faithful old one, and it's online. Young's is another, an analytical concordance, and there was this concordance here for the Septuagint Greek words. It's done by a gentleman called Morish. And so I looked up this verse from Proverbs 8:19, and sure enough, choice silver, quality silver, was in view. But I then found that there is a total of 89 places where the word eklektos is found in the Septuagint because of this concordance. And the vast majority of them where they're directly translated from a Hebrew word, because sometimes the word is added where there's no Hebrew equivalent, or it's just a bit of a paraphrase or so on. And this is how language happens. When you translate, sometimes you use other words, or sometimes you add words to clarify the meaning. And so there are 74 clear-cut places where eklektos is found directly translating a Hebrew word. And there are 24 Hebrew words which are directly translated by eklektos. One of those is bakir, which you've mentioned. And that only appears 13 times. So out of the 74, take away 13, you're left with 61. And out of the 61, the vast majority relate to Hebrew words used to mean quality. So we have the fat cows that came out of the Nile in Pharaoh's dream, eklektos cows. The fat kernels of wheat, again in the next dream, eklektos wheat. Young men, guys in their prime, eklektos, several times. Pleasant land, eklektos. Highest branches, eklektos. Rich apparel, eklektos. Highest branches, I think I've mentioned. Quality. So when Jesus says, many are called, few eklektos, he's saying, few are fit, few up to the calling. So I translate that, few have mettle, METTLE. And so this is quite significant, you know. We've got 61 places. Eklektos directly translates Hebrew words, and 51 of those is clearly about quality, without dispute. But there's 10 out of these 61 which give you an idea that maybe it should be about chosen. It should be about elect. And so I included all of that information in a booklet which I produced in 2001 or 2002, can't remember. I produced it, and the Bible Society got several more copies once I gave them the initial one. And it was interesting, but the doubt element was still very much inside, because I just shared what I discovered. But I thought this was important because the majority use was for quality. And in fact, Young's literal translation, the man who produced the Analytical Concordance, uses it that way in the New Testament. He's one of the few versions that does in the English. And for example, the choice sojourners, dwellers, in 1 Peter 1, he uses choice there as quality. And so I then produced another book which had all that information in the booklet was in the back as an appendix, and then I did another one with better analysis. But I still didn't do enough to clearly demonstrate or remove the doubt element. Those 10 places are from 4 Hebrew words. And the most important of these is bakar. There's bakar, there's mibkar, there's bara, and there's bakur. Bakur is the word for young man. It occurs once only. As eklektos, meaning of chosen. It does occur other times as young man. Mibkar, similarly, but there's 2 of those. And bara once, which is to the pure, you will show yourself pure, correctly meaning thing. But there's one place where it's translated as chosen. So the real one to look at, of which there are 6 out of 8 with the meaning of chosen in the King James Version, is bakar. Now bakar is the most important word out of those to give a doubt, because it's the main Hebrew word, bakar, for to choose. In fact, in the King James, it's 77 times used for choosing. Incidentally, it's also 77 times also used for chosen. So, obviously that would be if this is a valid translation of for eklektos, since it's using that word, it's translating that word, that's where it would be. But, so in 2015 I did an exhaustive look at every Hebrew word in every place it occurs. When I say every Hebrew word, every one of those 24 that eklektos translates, I've looked at every place where they're found in the Septuagint and done a full analysis. And what you find with bakar, before I do, I just need to mention all 4 I mention of those Hebrew words which give the doubt, I mention in a separate video, which I've already done, and I will link you to that in the information below. But I just want to concentrate on bakar here, because it's the main one to really address, because if there's any validity to eklektos having a meaning of chosen or elect, then it's with this translation of this word bakar, because everywhere else it's really about quality. So bakar, well, like the word in English we have for table, where I'm sitting at the table, then we understand by those words next to word table that it means about the piece of furniture with 4 legs or more. Same as if I said chair. If I'm sitting on a chair, the word sitting on means I'm sitting on this piece of furniture with legs. But both those words table and chair can mean something completely different. They're spelt the same way, pronounced the same way. So if I said the chair of the committee, who sat on a leather chair, that word chair doesn't mean the piece of furniture anymore, the first chair. It means the person at the head of this group that is assembled. Similarly, if I said the book on the table has opened to a page which has a table of contents. So a table of contents there doesn't mean the piece of furniture, it means this assembly, this laid out assembly of details is called a table, like a mathematical table, for example. So the word table and chair there have two meanings, and they're understood by the immediate words before and after. And this context frames for us the word being looked at as to whether it's the first meaning or the second meaning. And so it's the same with bakar. When you look at every place where bakar is, you find there is a pattern for two different meanings. The first meaning, as I've already mentioned, is to choose. It's the biggest meaning of all. But there is a good chunk of number of words, a number of places, translated by a number of words, which it's about quality. It's about people who are, or items to be chosen, to be preferred, excellent. And on that basis, bakar is used and translated as, in the Greek, and indeed in English, as neaniskos, young man, boy, or even neanias, similar. Neanias is young man also, and dunatos, strong, mighty, able. Those words don't mean to choose or chosen. They mean, this is something of quality, something to be preferred, something to be chosen. Dunatos, mighty, powerful, able, young, neaniskos and neanias. And all those 6 places where eklektos is found, the same pattern of words next to it, etc., show they are used exactly the same way. Neanias, neaniskos, and dunatos. It's the quality meaning of bakar, to be chosen, preferred, excellent. So, and it is not in the same pattern as the to choose or chosen, which eklego or hieretizo properly translate in the New Testament as chosen, and also translate bakar in those places. And so in the Septuagint. And so the doubt element is out the window. Eklektos is about quality in every place where it is found in the Septuagint. And so when you consider that the early church Christian, for the first 3 to 4, only read Greek in his reading of the New Testament letters and Gospels, and in his reading of the Old Testament version, he only read the word eklektos. And if that means just quality there, that's how he read it in the New Testament too. So when you read it elect in the English Bible, and there's no place where eklektos isn't connected to it, because every place where it is in the Old Testament, eklektos is in the Septuagint, and every place where elect is found in New Testament, it's from eklektos. So when you read about the elect, you need to think about the quality guys, the righteous, the saints. You need to think about elect angels, the good angels, as opposed to the bad ones. Elect lady, the excellent lady. So excellent is probably the best English word to translate it. But there's no emphasis, no iota of a emphasis on chosen or to choose. Just to be chosen, preferred, excellent, quality. As I mentioned earlier, in our recap, the fat cows come out in the know. Eklektos cows. Fat kernels of wheat. Eklektos wheat. Young men, guys in their prime, used as soldiers. Eklektos. Highest branches, eklektos. Pleasant land, eklektos. Quality silver. Tried stone, eklektos. Rich apparel, eklektos. Quality, quality, quality. Many are called, few eklektos. Few are fit, few up to the calling. Few have metal. The early church didn't have the idea of elect in their reading of eklektos in their Bible.